Most of the new information that I'm covering today comes from a very recently released short, TikTok reel, whatever. Can you save a civ in crisis? And I will link that, as always, down below with the rest of our sources. Let's get into it. So, the first thing that we need to understand is what a crisis actually is. And of course, in Civilization, there are many events that you'll encounter, some good, some bad, and the crisis events are probably the bad ones. As you move through each of the 3 ages, you will encounter, continue through, and ultimately face the climax of a crisis. In this case, in the first age, you can see that the crisis adds 2 things. Firstly, a crisis policy slot, and this will be consistent throughout all of them. Secondly, it adds independent encampments which grow stronger, and that is unique to the first crisis event. As you can see from this screen, there are many crisis policy cards to choose from, and generally they're infused with some fairly negative effects. And up the top here, finally, before we get to the new information, you'll see that there's a timeline. Generally speaking, the crisis event makes up a fairly small portion of the game, though it will happen 3 times, 3 different events throughout the 3 ages. So cumulatively, you might be facing quite a bit of this. Speaking of this, let's quickly listen to all of the different ways that a crisis event could play out in an empire.
There are various ways that these crises can impact you. Some will be impacting religion, or through combat, economy, resources, or even diseases.
Across the board, these crisis events impact gameplay as well as your policies. Here, from the short, we see a couple of new events. This one is quite interesting. It basically talks about civilization becoming hungry to grow, hungry to expand, spread to new lands. Once wasteland, now turns into pasture. Obviously, the threat here is aggressive expansion, though how it plays out exactly, I don't know. Next up, we have a strange year. Rain, harder and heavier than before. And then all of a sudden, rats and mice follow, and worse, on the fringes, illness spreads. And this was perhaps the main focus of the short. What I suspect is a crisis event in the second age focused around a plague, right? A spread of disease. There are a couple of other kind of interesting things to note here. We also see some of the policy cards tied to these events. Firstly, towns suffer greatly down the bottom, 75% decrease in gold and food. Up the top left, you'll see you'll also lose a lot of strength against independent powers. One that is maybe more interesting and highlights a balance. On the left of this one, you see healing cults during the second age illness event, +5 happiness on altars, but they lose 10 gold. And this is kind of hinting at a point I want to reinforce. While these are negative effects, potentially disastrous for the game world and maybe your economy, they also lean into other things. Extra happiness, for example, will create celebrations, as well as fuel your specialists, who, as a gentle reminder, require both food and happiness. Finally, you might be missing out on some trade goods, while you're involved in conflict. So, that previous policy card, I'll bring it up again here, just to remind you in a moment, this one right here, +5 happiness, could actually be worthwhile to you. You might be making a whole load of money, not care about the minus gold, but desperately need the happiness. Moreover, we've seen this expanded very briefly in a past live stream. Some of the other possible crisis policies mention migrants there in the middle with miasma, though your growth will be decreased, as well as another one about happiness and commanders. Or maybe you'll want to get some extra food in towns at a trade-off, losing healing on your units. Ultimately, there's an opportunity cost to these potentially disastrous effects. A couple of other quick things in the short that I wanted to highlight before we move on to some deeper analysis. This religion benefit looks great. Culture, gold, and science for wonders in foreign settlements that follow your religion. An interesting twist on the gameplay. They also quickly highlighted how combat, these resources, and what I suspect, as you can see here, is the spread of disease, will impact the visual look of your cities as your empire moves through the 3 crisis events. Just for a moment, taking a quick sidestep, I'd like to introduce what is perhaps the best win-win for gamers and charities of all time. It's the Jingle Jam, and in 2024, I'm thrilled to be participating in this charity fundraiser, one that I've followed since its inception almost a decade ago. If you donate £35 or more, all going to these charities, great ones like War Child, you'll receive a whole load of great games for free. I realize for a lot of us, times are not easy, and there's absolutely no pressure here. Donate as little or as much as you'd like, and if you're not interested at all, that's totally fine. You can use the link in the description down below or the QR code on screen to donate. It's all charity, it's not sponsored, I don't take a cut, nobody does. It's nothing like that. Thank you for at least considering supporting a cause this holiday season. Now, let's get back to the video, where we return to both some extra detail that I've pulled from previous live streams, as well as my own wild speculation, hopefully informed by some evidence about how I think the 3x3, the 9 total randomized crisis events may play out. Firstly, some highlights from the Exploration Age stream. You can see the crisis event, the first one, where barbarians rise up. Again, we believe one of 3 possible events per age. In this case, of course, at the end of the first age, the Antiquity Age. You can see that the barbarians are fairly strong and also fairly numerous. Encampments pop up in free area between cities, and they're fairly dangerous. There's also a couple of quite interesting looking units here, like a dude with a staff. However, I also note there's an Egyptian unit that's exactly the same, so perhaps not a unique unit to the Barbs, who seem fairly strong, roughly on par with units that are already defending within a friendly city. Yikes. These units are believed to pop up all over the show, and it's something that I've briefly almost experienced when I got to play Civ 7 a few months ago. That's of course just one example though, right? Like I say, there are, we believe, 3 possible crisis events per age, so 9 possible ones in total. And that brings me to perhaps the final part of this video, and maybe a slightly speculative one. This clip you will have seen probably a million times. Certainly if you've watched my videos you have, but it's important because it highlights the 3 ages, the 3 periods where we'll encounter crises. In the first age, and second, this one here, the exploration, I have some ideas, though it's perhaps this final age, the modern age, that intrigues me the most. Will the crisis events be economic collapse, think Great Depression, climate change, think sea and air, or perhaps Firaxis will go the nuclear option and introduce a kind of nuclear apocalypse crisis? I don't know. In the earlier ages, we know that barbarians will rise up. In the exploration age, of course, we've seen in this video that disease, that plague event. And I theorize also maybe one to do with colonial conflict. Something about distant lands, extra strength, conquest, I think could play out in that age as well, because of course these crises events aren't just random. The policies aren't just random, right? They're meant to be tied to that historical period, which is why when I theorize about the modern age, I think about massive economic collapse, Great Depression. I think about climate, air, water quality, rising seas that we have of course seen before in Civilization 6, much to people's dismay sometimes. And that brings me to my final point. I really hope that these events aren't just feel-bad events. And I think there's good evidence to suggest that they won't be, given that there's a trade-off here, as we've already discussed, an opportunity cost, and sometimes benefits to be found within a crisis. Though, thinking back to previous games, sometimes these things do just kind of, again, like I say, as I've coined them a few times, feel like feels-bad events to just punish the player. Hopefully, the crises will be dynamic enough and feel connected enough to the ages that won't be a problem for Civilization 7. Let me know your theories down below. What crisis event do you think will be popping up? And thank you so much if you've donated to the Jingle Jam this year. I've set a pretty high target for us, considering I'm not a Yogscast big channel or anything. I don't know if we can hit £1,000, but setting a lower target would have been cowardice of me. So please do consider supporting this event, which has meant a lot to me over a very long time if you can. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.